The fateful night in Marion. It was an unusually quiet October evening in 2003 when a deep chill hung over the small town of Marion, Illinois. The kind of chill that, paired with the stillness of the air and the muted flicker of porch lights, made even the most mundane neighborhood seem shadowed in mystery. But for the residents of this quaint Midwestern town, what occurred that night was neither mundane nor mysterious. It was horrifyingly real. The sequence of events began at approximately 10:15 p.m., when retired schoolteacher Mary Henderson, sitting in her living room knitting a scarf, was startled by an ear-splitting scream. It came from an alley 2 blocks away, piercing the tranquility with a raw, unrelenting terror. "At first I thought it was just some teens playing a prank or maybe a dogfight," she later told reporters. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized the sound wasn't stopping. It was growing sharper, more desperate. Mary called the police immediately, her hands trembling as she gripped the phone. When Officer Richard Conway and his partner David Flores responded to the call, they found a crowd of confused, pajama-clad neighbors clustered near the alley entrance. They pushed their way through the throng, flashlights cutting through the dark. What they saw next, illuminated in the cold light of their flashlights, would haunt them for years. On the ground lay the lifeless body of 24-year-old Lucy Parker, a bright, ambitious college graduate who had moved back to Marion to assist her ailing mother. She was sprawled face up on the damp ground, her features distorted in what seemed to be a grimace of indescribable pain. Blood pooled around her head, staining the gravel and seeping into the cracks. But the most horrifying discovery became apparent as they got closer. Her eyes were missing. Where her gaze should have met theirs, there were only hollow, grotesque voids. Officer Flores instinctively recoiled, muttering under his breath, "Jesus Christ!" Flannel-robed onlookers gasped in unison, one woman collapsing into the arms of her neighbor while another began sobbing uncontrollably. The scene was chaotic, yet beyond the cacophony of wailing voices and police radios, the ominous silence of Marion itself seemed to close in tighter. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, a curious detail that suggested Lucy had been caught entirely off guard. Whatever happened to her, it had been savage, deliberate, and horrifyingly precise. As the first responders worked the scene, Detective Claire Roberts was at home preparing for bed when her pager beeped. An urgent message summoned her to the crime scene, a sense of dread filling her chest before her boots even hit the pavement. Claire was no stranger to grisly cases, but something about the call's tone told her this was different. This wasn't just murder, this was something profoundly wrong. When Claire arrived at the alley, she was greeted by Officer Conway's grim expression. "You're gonna want to see this, detective," he said, his voice subdued. Claire crouched next to Lucy's body, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. She noted the meticulously clean nature of the act, the precision of the cuts, the absence of the victim's eyes, and the complete lack of defensive wounds on her hands or forearms. It was as if the assailant had either incapacitated her instantly, or caught her in a moment of complete vulnerability. Neighbors interviewed on the spot offered little help. Witness statements varied. Some claimed they had heard footsteps running away shortly after the scream, while others mentioned a shadowy figure seen lingering near the alley earlier that evening. But one detail remained consistent. None of them had seen the killer's face. "It was like they weren't even there," a young man nervously stammered. As investigators secured the area and began to canvass the neighborhood, whispers of, "Who could have done something like this?" began to ripple through the crowd. Lucy Parker was well loved in the community, known for her radiant smile and generous spirit. The thought of someone targeting her seemed unfathomable, but the evidence was there, glaring and horrific. By the time the body was transported to the morgue for further analysis, Marion was buzzing with fear and speculation. Porch lights stayed on all night, the hum of hushed conversations and panicked phone calls reverberating through quiet homes. Families hugged their children tighter and locked their doors. Yet for the detectives and officers laboring over the chilling reality of the crime scene, there was no room for speculation, only facts. And the facts pointed to an undeniable truth: the person responsible for Lucy's death was still out there. Somewhere in the cold, unassuming shadows of Marion, a predator lurked, and this fateful night was just the beginning of their reign of terror. The first chilling clue. In the hours that followed Lucy Parker's murder, the air in Marion seemed to grow heavier, as if the entire town held its breath while police investigated. The alley where her body had been found was blocked off by yellow crime scene tape, the harsh glare of portable floodlights bathing the area in an otherworldly glow. Tire tracks and hurried footprints in the dirt revealed curious onlookers who had tried, unsuccessfully, to get a closer look before being pushed back by officers. It wasn't just the shock of the murder, the brutality of it, the precision with which her eyes had been removed, made everyone uneasy. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was something far worse. Detective Claire Roberts walked the perimeter of the crime scene as the forensic team combed through every inch of the alley. The ground was uneven, from years of rain cutting rivulets into the dirt, and faint impressions of what could have been shoe prints dotted the areas near Lucy's body. "Get me a cast of those immediately," Claire directed, motioning to the team. She crouched by one particularly distinct print. It was slightly larger than average, perhaps a size 11. The deep grooves in the heel indicated a well-worn tread, with a unique patterned sole, a hallmark of someone who had walked plenty in those shoes. Was this the first sign of the killer? Beside the shoe print, she noticed something faint glimmering in the floodlight's beam. "Wait!" she called out. Grabbing a pair of gloves from her coat pocket, she reached down and picked up what appeared to be a tiny shard of glass. It wasn't much, just a stray sliver, but years of experience told her no detail was too small to ignore. She handed it off to one of the forensic technicians. "Check for DNA or fibers," she instructed. For all she knew, the shard could have come from a broken bottle tossed in the alley years ago, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach that told her to treat it as though it might be more. As the forensic team processed the scene, Officer Richard Conway returned from searching nearby trash cans. He carried a tattered piece of fabric in a plastic evidence bag. "Found this stuffed behind a dumpster a few yards back," he said, holding it up for Claire to examine. She furrowed her brow as she leaned closer. "Looks like part of a shirt or maybe a jacket," she murmured. The torn edge of the fabric bore faint smudges of what appeared to be blood. It wasn't much to go on, but if it belonged to the killer, it was another breadcrumb in the trail. Or, too optimistically, it could lead directly to them. The eeriest discovery, however, was the lack of obvious evidence. The scene felt oddly clean. The absence of defensive wounds on Lucy's body, coupled with the precise removal of her eyes, suggested an unsettling level of composure and skill. This wasn't someone who lost control in a blind rage, Claire muttered to herself as she chewed on the end of her pen. This was methodical. By the end of the night, the evidence bag sat neatly in the trunk of the police SUV, waiting to be cataloged and processed at the station. The muddy shoe print, the shard of glass, the scrap of bloody fabric. Individually, they were faint traces of a predator. Together, Claire hoped they could sketch a clearer picture of the person who had turned Marion's quiet streets into a hunting ground. The next day, the shoe print cast came back from the lab. Its shape and tread pattern suggested an older make of work boot, the kind sold at hardware stores or outdoor supply chains. It wasn't a mass-market sneaker popular in the city. It was plain and practical, something you'd expect a person in a rural area to wear, someone who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. There was also another troubling detail. The prints found at the crime scene didn't follow one clear path. Instead, they seemed almost deliberate, stepping forward only to stop abruptly, then turning back toward the alley's lone exit. This peculiar pattern suggested the killer took their time. They didn't flee the scene after the act. They lingered. "Jesus," Officer Flores muttered when Claire showed him the details. "They hung around. Why would they do that?" "Because they were in control," Claire answered, her voice quiet but firm. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attack. Whoever did this isn't just dangerous. They're calculated. They're thinking 3 steps ahead." Adding to the chill in the investigation was the forensic report on the piece of fabric from the dumpster. While the blood on the fabric matched Lucy's type, there was a second unidentified marker, perhaps from the killer. The lab team worked around the clock to extract DNA, but the process would take time. Meanwhile, Claire turned her attention to questioning the neighbors again. Some claimed they had noticed a man loitering in the weeks prior, dressed in dark nondescript clothing, always keeping his face obscured by the hood of a jacket. Others mentioned seeing a weathered pickup truck parked near the alley after dark, but no one had gotten close enough to catch a license plate. One chilling account came from a young boy who told his parents he'd noticed the figure standing near the alley late at night, their silhouette absolutely still, as if watching and waiting. The pieces were beginning to form a blurry picture, but one thing was becoming abundantly clear. Whoever this killer was, they had done this before, or would do it again. Marion, once a place of porch-lit evenings and friendly neighborhood waves, was beginning to feel shadowed by an unseen evil. Children weren't allowed to play in the streets after dusk, and locks were checked at least twice before families went to bed. Back in the station, Claire sat at her desk, her hands folded over the report from the lab. The fragmented clues brought more questions than answers, but with each step forward, she could feel the tension tightening like a noose. Somewhere in the town, someone already knew how this story would unfold. They knew where they'd strike next. And Claire had an unshakable certainty. They weren't done yet. Could this be a serial killer? The town of Marion was still reeling from the brutal murder of Lucy Parker when another shocking discovery sent waves of fear rippling through the community. Less than 2 weeks after Lucy's mutilated body was found, authorities responded to a second grisly crime. This time, the victim was 27-year-old Darren Brooks, a mechanic known for his quiet demeanor and hardworking nature. He was found dead in his backyard shed, killed with the same horrifying precision as Lucy. His eyes had been removed. "You're telling me this isn't some random lunatic?" Detective Claire Roberts asked, her voice thick with frustration as she addressed the crime scene team. She stood in Darren's backyard, her breath visible in the harsh November air. "2 murders, 2 sets of missing eyes, either we have a copycat or this is the same damn person evolving." The experts couldn't deny the chilling similarities. Both victims had been discovered in vulnerable locations, Lucy in a dark alley, Darren within his private shed. Both scenes revealed a complete lack of defensive wounds, suggesting the victims may have been incapacitated quickly, perhaps sedated or ambushed. Most disturbingly, both had their eyes surgically removed with near-pristine precision. Whoever was behind these murders wasn't just calculating, they were skilled. As Claire studied the mounting evidence, she realized she might be dealing with something she had hoped to never encounter: a serial killer. Marion, a quiet Midwestern town known for its community potlucks and high school football games, suddenly seemed like the least likely but tragically perfect hunting ground. "What's the profile on someone who does this kind of thing?" Claire asked FBI profiler Ellen Wagner, who had been called in after Darren's murder. The grizzled profiler leaned against the crime scene van, her arms crossed against the cold. "A killer like this?" Ellen said, her voice dangerously calm. "Their MO is escalating, the removal of the eyes. It isn't rage, it's ritualistic. This person is taking them as trophies. They're organized, methodical, and careful. They're probably local. They know the area well enough to evade detection. But here's the kicker, Claire." Ellen locked eyes with her. "They don't stop. These 2 murders? This is just the beginning." Claire's stomach sank. She'd known this deep down, but hearing it aloud gave her dread a sharper edge. "So what we're saying is, this person, they're hunting?" "Exactly," Ellen confirmed. "They've spent years thinking about this, maybe even fantasizing about it. And now that they've acted on it, it's like a switch flipped. They won't be able to stop themselves. They've tasted the rush too many times." Back at the station, the investigative team gathered around a whiteboard where 2 photos had been pinned side by side: Lucy Parker and Darren Brooks. A mix of exhaustion and determination hung in the air as Claire clapped her hands to bring focus to the room. "Listen up, everyone. 2 victims in the span of 2 weeks. The level of precision and lack of evidence are screaming at us. This is the same person. We have to assume that there's a very real chance they're going to kill again, and soon." Officer Richard Conway raised his hand hesitantly. "Do we have anything to suggest why this guy, if it's the same guy, is taking the eyes? I mean, is it symbolic or something?" Ellen, standing silently at the back of the room until now, stepped forward. "Trophies," she said firmly. "He's keeping them to relive the act, to feel power. It's not uncommon in killers with a compulsive need for control. The eyes specifically, it's personal. Some killers view eyes as the windows to the soul. Taking them might make him feel like he's stealing something intangible from his victims." The room fell silent. The gravity of Ellen's words painted an even darker picture of an already terrifying reality. This wasn't just about murder, it was about dominance, obsession, and ritual. "The press is already sniffing around," Claire said, breaking the silence. "If they start throwing around the term serial killer, this town's gonna lose it. I don't want to say it until we're sure." Ellen tilted her head. "With respect, Claire, the patterns are clear. I think you already know what you're dealing with. You just have to decide when to admit it. Public panic is inevitable, but it might also flush this guy out. You announcing you know his game, that could make him reckless." Claire nodded hesitantly, fully aware of the weight of her next steps. "We've got nothing reliable to go on yet. No fingerprints, no hair, no fibers that lead anywhere. This guy's too careful." She paused, her hand unconsciously scribbling notes on her legal pad. "But he left us 2 bodies. and those bodies are telling us everything we need to know, if we're paying attention. Over the next several days, the investigative team chased every lead, no matter how small. Interviews with Darren's family and neighbors revealed no immediate enemies, no lingering tensions. He was by all accounts an ordinary man in an ordinary town. Likewise, no one had seen or heard anything unusual the night he was killed. No suspicious cars, no strange noises. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air after executing their grim act. The lack of motive, or at least an obvious one, confounded the investigators. Most murders had a clear starting point, a grudge, a robbery, an act of passion. But these killings? They felt disconnected from reason. Claire couldn't shake the idea that the victims were being selected randomly, that they were unfortunate players in someone else's dark theater. One night, while poring over maps of the town and correlating the locations of the murders, Claire noticed a small but significant detail. Both crime scenes were within walking distance of heavily wooded areas, the kind of place someone could hide, stalk, and wait. The realization chilled her. If the killer knew the back roads, trails, and alleyways of Marion, they could move like a ghost through the town, unseen, untraceable. In her next briefing with the team, Claire circled the wooded belts on the projected map. If this killer is local, they know these woods, they know how to vanish before anyone gets a look at them. We need to sweep these areas, today. As officers prepared their search grids, Marion was descending further into paranoia. Doors were locked tightly before the sun even set. Dogs barked at the slightest sound. Neighbors stopped waving from porches, choosing instead to peer suspiciously through curtains. The killer's shadow lingered heavy over the town, and for Claire, the most unsettling thought was this. They were finally stepping into the mind of the monster, into the psyche of someone who was always 3 moves ahead. Marion wasn't just haunted by the thought of a serial killer, it was being hunted by one. Neighbors turn against one another. The murders were horrifying enough, but by the time the second body was found, something else had started to take root in Marion. Suspicion. The close-knit Midwestern town, where neighbors once borrowed sugar and sat on each other's porches without invitation, began to feel eerily like a collection of strangers. Invisible lines of mistrust formed between homes that had stood together for decades. It started subtly. More locks began appearing on doors that rarely needed them before. Windows, once left cracked open to catch the cool fall breeze, were now shut tight, reinforced with wooden dowels or security bars purchased at the newly overwhelmed hardware store downtown. Neighborhood gossip no longer revolved around who was putting up the biggest Christmas light display or whose dog had barked all night. Now, the whispers were darker, angrier. "Have you noticed how often Frank stays out late?" someone would mutter in hushed tones at the grocery store. "Yeah," another would agree, "and he's been acting weird lately. I mean, his boots. You ever seen them? They're big, like size 11 or something." Or at the local diner. "I saw Evelyn cleaning the trunk of her car at 2 a.m. 2 nights ago. No one cleans their car in the middle of the night unless they're hiding something, right?" It didn't matter how innocuous the detail. In Marion's growing atmosphere of fear, every action was suspect. "What if it's someone we know?" became a refrain overheard in church pews, school parking lots, and backyards, spreading like wildfire. One of the particularly unsettling developments came from Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. Everyone knew Eleanor. She was the quintessential Midwestern grandma, always baking cookies for the neighborhood kids and waving cheerily from her garden. But after the murders, her demeanor changed. One by one, she stopped speaking to her neighbors. "I just can't trust anyone," Eleanor admitted to her sister over the phone. She began keeping her blinds drawn during the day and hung heavy blackout curtains in her kitchen. It was during one of her late-night vigils from her living room window that she thought she saw something. A figure, tall and lurking, walking near the edge of the woods behind her house. Eleanor told no one about the sighting at first, convinced people would think her paranoid. But 2 nights later across the street, Melanie Harper swore she heard faint tapping on her back door around the same time. Unrelated incidents? Maybe. But in Marion, no one believed in coincidences anymore. By the following week, neighbors had abandoned their usual civility. Jim Dupree, a retired firefighter, found himself cornered by 2 of his friends in the parking lot of First National Bank. "You gotta admit, Jim, this is the second week in a row your porch light was off the night that kid Darren Brooks was killed," one of them said, their tone half concerned, half accusatory. Jim's face flushed red. "For Christ's sake, I was asleep like everyone else," he barked back. You think I'm going out slicing people's eyes up? Go check my goddamn shoes if you don't believe me. And that was becoming another problem. People weren't keeping their suspicions to themselves. Several residents noticed their garbage bins rifled through, likely by suspicious neighbors searching for receipts, gloves, or anything they could use as evidence. One woman, waking up to the sound of her screen door creaking, caught a man she barely recognized, crouched on her front porch. He was examining a pair of muddy boots she kept by the door. Before she had a chance to call the police, he stammered an apology and darted off into the darkness. Small-town secrets soon turned into fiery accusations. Some longtime neighbors accused each other of hiding odd behavior. Mysteries from decades past, even ones as minor as a borrowed lawnmower never returned, resurfaced in tense conversations. Those who had lived in Marion their entire lives, familiar with everyone's routines and quirks, suddenly found themselves questioning even the most basic assumptions. And then came the list. One Sunday afternoon, flyers appeared on mailboxes and the bulletin board at Charlie's gas station. Know a potential suspect? Tall men wearing boots? Quiet neighbors? Anyone acting out of the ordinary lately? The flyer had no origin, no signature, and no official backing. The police later confirmed they weren't the ones circulating it, but the damage was already done. The town erupted into a frenzy of paranoia, with people reporting their neighbors over the most trivial of reasons. Ed's bought a new axe. Suspicious, don't you think? One anonymous note read. There's a guy over on Pine Street who goes for a walk every night at 11 p.m. Nobody walks that late unless they're hiding something, read another. Then came the first act of outright retaliation. A teenager had started a rumor that the local auto mechanic, Sam Rayburn, matched the profile of the supposed killer. Quiet, worked with tools, owned muddy boots. The gossip spiraled until one morning, someone spray-painted "murderer" in red letters across the side of Sam's shop. People want to burn me at the stake already, Sam lamented to Officer Conway after reporting the vandalism. But I'll tell you what, I've lived here my whole life. And let's not kid ourselves. It ain't strangers you should be worried about. It's usually someone right under your nose. The police department found themselves overwhelmed, not just by the pressure of solving the case, but now also by Marion spiraling into chaos. Detectives like Claire Roberts knew the distrust was only making their job harder. Every crackpot tip and baseless accusation made it feel like they were running in circles. Worse, they feared the killer might be relishing the pandemonium. This is what they want, Claire remarked to Conway one evening, slamming a pile of false tips onto her desk. Whoever's doing this, they're probably sitting back and watching this town tear itself apart. But amidst all the chaos, one fact loomed larger than gossip, suspicion, or paranoia. The killer was still out there, and Marion was starting to eat itself from within. The state investigation team steps in. By the time the second body was found, Marion was already in a frenzy of fear and suspicion. Locked doors, whispered accusations, and sleepless nights painted a bleak portrait of a town spiraling out of control. But the discovery of Darren Brooks' mutilated body, eerily similar to Lucy Parker's, shifted the case to an entirely new level. The Marion Police Department, a small-town team more accustomed to petty thefts and high school disputes, quickly realized they were in over their heads. The call was made, a request for the state investigation team. Leading the team was Detective Harry Miles, a seasoned investigator whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and caution. With over 25 years of service, Miles had built a reputation for solving cases that others deemed impossible, cases that required not just sharp instincts but also a steady demeanor under pressure. "If anyone can find this guy, it's Miles," a local officer murmured when the team rolled into town. The state team arrived with an entourage of unmarked vehicles, bristling with equipment and technology that Marion's local force could only dream of acquiring. The sight was both reassuring and intimidating to the townsfolk who gathered outside the station, craning to catch a glimpse of their would-be saviors. Inside the station, Claire Roberts wasted no time briefing Miles, spreading crime scene photos, reports, and maps across the table. She spoke quickly but concisely, her frustration and fatigue seeping through as she relayed the details of the two murders. Miles listened without interrupting, his sharp eyes scanning each photograph with an intensity that made Claire feel like she might have missed something, even though she knew every detail by heart. When Claire finished, Miles leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're dealing with a predator," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Not just a killer, a hunter. Look at the precision, the lack of defensive wounds, the choice of victims." He tapped the photo of Lucy Parker with a calloused finger. This girl didn't see it coming, neither did your mechanic. Whoever this is, they're methodical, controlled, and worst of all, they're comfortable. Comfortable? Claire repeated, frowning. Miles nodded. You're not dealing with someone who's afraid of getting caught. They're not panicking or sloppy. They're playing a carefully planned game, and right now they think they're winning. The room fell silent as the weight of Miles's words settled over the gathered officers. So, what's the plan? Officer Conway finally asked, his voice breaking through the tension. Miles stood, pulling a marker from his pocket and circling points on the map spread across the table. First, we treat this like what it is, the work of a serial killer. That means no more reactive policing. We get ahead of this guy. We profile him, map out his movements, and figure out his next step before he makes it. He turned to Claire. How far out have you canvassed these woods? He asked, pointing to the areas surrounding the crime scenes that Claire had already highlighted. We've done preliminary sweeps, she said, narrowing her eyes defensively. It's been tough with limited manpower, but it's not enough, Miles interrupted, not unkindly. This killer knows these woods. They're using them as cover, maybe even as staging grounds. We need full-scale operations out here. Cameras, drones, foot patrols. If this is where they're moving, we'll box them in. Claire nodded, already making mental notes on how to allocate resources for what Miles was suggesting. Miles continued. Second, we stay quiet. He turned to the Marion officers. I know you've got reporters sniffing around and the town's already a powder keg. If word gets out that we think these murders are connected, or, God help us, that we're looking at a serial killer, this place will tear itself apart faster than this guy ever could. Too late, Conway muttered under his breath. That's already happening. Then we get control back, Miles said firmly. We can't have the town working against us. Talk to these people. Reassure them without promising anything you can't deliver. They need to know we're here, but they don't need to know how bad this really is. Harry, interjected Ellen Wagner, the FBI profiler who had stayed silent through most of the meeting. We can't completely keep this quiet. The patterns are too obvious and we've already got 2 bodies in rapid succession. The killer won't stop and people will notice. The question is, do we wait for them to panic on their own, or do we control the narrative? Miles scratched his chin thoughtfully, weighing Ellen's argument. We'll handle it one step at a time, he said finally. Let me see what we're dealing with first before we go tipping our hand. With that, Miles directed his team to take over the investigation. High-tech forensic equipment was wheeled into the station, making the cluttered back office look more like a crime lab from a TV show. Analysts began re-examining evidence that had already been collected, looking for details that might have been overlooked. Datasets from state archives were pulled in to compare the Marion killings with unsolved cases across the region. Every thread, no matter how thin, was followed. Claire couldn't help but feel slightly sidelined as she watched Miles's team in action. This had been her case first. She had been the one to gather the pieces, to start piecing together the grim puzzle. But now she had to admit, however grudgingly, that these people were good, better than what Marion alone could muster. By the evening, Miles called for another meeting. We've got something, he said, gesturing at a whiteboard now covered with photographs, maps, and scribbled notes. Look at the patterns. Both crime scenes are close to wooded areas. Both involve victims who were likely caught off guard but not forcibly restrained. That suggests they were surprised, maybe even tricked, and most importantly, he pointed at a timeline drawn along the bottom of the board. The timing is escalating. Whoever this is, they're not just killing, they're accelerating. If we don't stop them now, there will be another victim soon, maybe days. A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone knew what was at stake. So, what do we do next? Claire asked quietly. We make them feel cornered, Miles said, his eyes glinting with determination. We put the pressure on every crack and shadow in this town until they slip up. For now, we assume this person lives here. They're not an outsider. They're just like everyone else in Marion, blending in. Ellen chimed in. And when they start to feel like we're closing in, you can bet they'll make a mistake. That's when we'll catch them. Miles narrowed his eyes at the board one last time, tapping his knuckle against Lucy Parker's photo. Whoever you are, he murmured under his breath, almost as if speaking to the killer directly, we're coming for you. A quiet period. Is the killer hiding? The weeks after Darren Brooks's murder felt like walking through a storm that had suddenly gone still. For the first time in months, there were no screams piercing the night, no new crime scenes uncovered in blood-soaked alleys or quiet backyards. The lights that had blazed behind Marion's windows late into the night began to dim as the townsfolk cautiously adjusted to the absence of new atrocities. But behind their uneasy relief was a gnawing fear. The killer wasn't gone. They were waiting. Detective Claire Roberts, like many others, found it difficult to sleep during this unexpected lull. For most of Marion's residents, the stillness felt like a reprieve, a chance to convince themselves that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. But Claire knew better. She had seen it before in other cases, that terrifying cycle predators followed. They didn't stop, they paused. They changed patterns, reevaluated, and hid until they saw an opening to strike again. "You don't think they're done, do you?" Officer Richard Conway asked one late evening as he and Claire stared at the murder board in the station's tiny conference room, cluttered with grim faces of the victims and a tangle of fraying red strings connecting maps and clues. His voice was tense and hoarse, remnants of sleepless nights spent chasing leads that led nowhere. Claire sighed, her eyes scanning Lucy Parker's photo, then Darren Brooks. "No, Rich, people like this, they don't stop, they find their rhythm again, maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but they surface. And when they do, someone else is going to pay for it." Officer Conway leaned against the desk, his arms crossed over his chest. But why the break? They were moving fast. 2 murders just weeks apart. Now nothing. What are they waiting for? "Could be anything," Claire answered, tapping her pen nervously against her notebook. "Maybe they're scoping out their next target. Or maybe they're watching us, seeing how we react." Her eyes darkened. They could be sitting in their living room right now, reading the papers, seeing their name whispered through the shadows around town. This lull might not mean they're dormant. It might mean they're preparing. The investigation team, now swollen with state officers and expert profilers, wasn't idle either. Miles, the lead investigator from the state team, had already warned that this quiet period could be more dangerous than the killings themselves. "It's called the cooling-off phase," he explained to the officers during a briefing one afternoon. "Killers like this, they have cycles, the act itself, the hunt, the aftermath. Those are like chapters in their story and they take time to digest each one. Right now, this guy's metabolizing what he's done, replaying the scenes in his head, getting ready for the next kill." That thought sickened Claire. "How long do these cooling-off phases usually last?" she asked, folding her arms tightly as though trying to contain her growing frustration. "Depends," Miles admitted. "Weeks, months, sometimes even years, though that's less likely here. The high they get from the killings doesn't last forever. Eventually they need another hit. And in the meantime, what? We sit on our hands and wait for him to strike?" Conway interjected bitterly. Miles shot him a look. "No, what we do is get smarter, faster, and sharper. This guy has to be somewhere. They always leave breadcrumbs. They just don't always know it." He turned back to the murder board and gestured toward one of the red highlighted patches of wooded areas west of the alley where Lucy had been found. "We keep digging here. If this is where they're lying low or preparing, we need to flush them out." Marion reacts. For the people of Marion, the quiet brought only a thin veneer of normalcy. Where residents had once jumped at every faint noise or shadow in their backyard, now there was a numbing fatigue to it all. Fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, simmering beneath forced smiles and hollow reassurances. At the diner, Melanie Harper and Eleanor Grayson, both deeply entrenched in the paranoia that had taken over the town, sat quietly at a corner booth. Their conversation, once dominated by discussions of family recipes or the upcoming holiday season, had shifted entirely to the presence of the killer. "You think maybe they're gone?" Melanie whispered, her eyes darting toward the door, as if the murderer might be standing just outside. Eleanor shook her head and sipped her coffee. "Gone? No, honey. Ain't no one just kills like that and walks away. They're still here. Could be somewhere close. Hell, could even be someone we've already spoken to." That idea hung between them for a moment before Melanie leaned closer. "That guy who works nights at the gas station, Rudy. Doesn't he give you the creeps? He was out by the woods last week, late at night. Who does that?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her skepticism tempered by the quiet paranoia she couldn't quite shake. "And what have the woods ever done to you, Melanie?" she replied dryly. But there was no denying the thought had gotten under her skin. This same type of whispering paranoia pulsed through every corner of town. At Sunday church services, neighbors subtly avoided each other's eyes, uneasy about who might secretly be harboring dark secrets. The local grocery store was busy but oddly silent, with conversations hushed or non-existent. Families went home early, rarely staying out past sunset. The school even canceled its annual Halloween carnival, sensing that its joyful festivities would be overshadowed by the unease that now blanketed Marion. "The kids don't need reminders of what's been happening," the school board president explained to frustrated parents. "It's not safe anyway, not with everything." The case remains active. At the station, Claire and the team endured what felt like an endless marathon of long nights and dead ends. Forensic reanalysis of evidence from Darren Brooks's scene produced no new compelling leads. The muddy boot print from Lucy's alley was compared against every known suspect's shoes, but there was no match. Even the tiny glass shard Claire had personally clipped from the ground came back clean, its origin still a mystery, but as Miles had promised, they didn't stop. Drones were deployed to sweep through the wooded areas again, patrolling both day and night in search of anything unusual: disturbed soil, hidden campsites, signs of stalking. The police partnered with community volunteers under careful supervision, combing larger wooded belts where they believed the killer might be hiding. Still, there was no sign of the person responsible for Marion's nightmare. One evening, as Claire sat in her office poring over the victim profiles for what felt like the 100th time, she noticed something that nagged at her. Lucy, young, open-hearted, full of promise. Darren, quiet, kind, a reliable man in the community. Two completely different people, yet their deaths were linked by grotesque precision. "Whatever connects them," Claire whispered to herself, "is something only the killer sees." From outside her office, she could hear boots scuffing against the tiles as Officer Conway entered. "You don't look so good. You eat tonight?" "No," Claire replied, distracted. "Have we even thought about the possibility he's targeting randomly?" Conway sighed, flopping heavily into a chair. "If it's random, then this bastard is even smarter than we thought. But I don't think it's random. There's always a reason, even if it's insane." Claire nodded, her pen tapping lightly on her desk. "Then we just have to find it, before he decides we've waited long enough." The quiet of Marion wasn't a sign of peace. It was a warning, and the team knew it was only a matter of time before the silence shattered once more. The fourth gruesome murder. By the first week of May 2004, while Marion was still simmering with restrained paranoia, the uneasy calm shattered once again. A jogger from out of town stumbled onto something horrifying during his early morning run by Fairview Lake, a quiet, picturesque spot located just outside the main boundary of Marion. What was once a serene escape from the fears lurking in town had turned into the scene of yet another nightmare. The fourth victim had been discovered, a middle-aged man named Thomas Miller. Unlike the two prior victims, who were younger in age, Thomas was 48 years old, a truck driver and lifelong bachelor who often kept to himself. He was not part of the town's tighter social circles, and some in Marion said without hesitation that they barely remembered him living there at all. Yet his savage murder broke from the previous presumed victim profile, forcing detectives to confront the growing chaos of the case. The scene by Fairview Lake detective Claire Roberts arrived at the scene as sunlight barely crept through the trees, accompanied by Officer Richard Conway, who seemed even more on edge than usual. Yellow tape cordoned off a section of the lake's edge, fluttering eerily in the crisp morning breeze. The state forensic team was already there, their boots crunching against the damp soil as they worked to preserve the footprint-laden ground. "What do we know so far?" Claire barked as she approached the lead forensic officer, her voice tight with tension. The officer grimaced. "What we know is, this one's just as bad, maybe worse. Male victim, mid to late 40s, no signs of a struggle, and," he paused, lowering his voice, "like before, his eyes are missing." Claire pinched the bridge of her nose and exhaled sharply, fighting the nausea rising in her stomach. The removal of the eyes wasn't just a pattern anymore, it had escalated into the gruesome signature of a disturbed mind. "Anything else?" Conway interjected. "The body was staged," the forensic officer continued, gesturing toward the crime scene just past the tree line. "That's new." Claire and Conway walked toward the lake's edge where the victim's body now lay, carefully avoiding the forensic technicians taking photographs. Thomas Miller had been left sprawled on his back in the mud, his arms folded neatly across his chest, giving the horrifying appearance of deliberate placement. As Claire moved in closer, she noticed that not only the eyes, but also his fingernails had been removed, carefully, surgically. Whoever had done this wasn't just focused on ritual. They were evolving, testing themselves, leaving new clues for the department to agonize over. "Jesus Christ," Conway muttered from beside her. He crossed his arms tightly as if bracing himself against the sight before him. "This guy's getting bolder, staging him like this. It's like he knows he has us on the ropes. Like he's mocking us." Claire swallowed, doing her best to keep her voice steady. He's arrogant or desperate to send a message, breaking the pattern. What set the murder of Thomas Miller apart from the others wasn't just his age or the eerie staging of his corpse. Thomas's connection to the community, or lack thereof, confused the initial working theory about the killer's preferences. Lucy Parker and Darren Brooks had been familiar faces in Marion. Lucy was bright and lively, Darren was friendly and hard-working, but Thomas lived quietly, seldom seen outside his home when his rig wasn't parked in the driveway. At the post-scene briefing later that same day, the investigative team crowded into the tiny station conference room. Detective Harry Miles stood over the whiteboard filled with frantic scribbles and photographs pinned in clusters. "We've been working under the assumption that the victims were deliberate targets," he began, his gravelly voice commanding the room. "Lucy and Darren, two individuals who were well-liked and had clear ties to the community, but Thomas Miller," he jabbed at the photograph of the man now pinned to the board, his grim face framed by stark black and white crime scene prints. "If this is the same unsub, and let's be honest, all evidence points to it, then either his method has changed, or the target selection was random this time." "This doesn't make sense," Claire said, shaking her head. "It's inconsistent. If he's a serial killer with this kind of precision and thought behind every move, why the shift? Why go after someone like Thomas?" Miles turned to FBI profiler Ellen Wagner, who was seated in the corner of the room, silently tapping her pen on her notepad. "Ellen, thoughts?" Ellen stood, brushing stray strands of hair out of her face as she took her place near the board. "Sometimes killers shift their profiles when they feel pressure. It could be intentional, to throw us off, or it could be impulsive. Maybe Thomas was an easy opportunity, a convenient victim. Maybe he walked into the wrong place at the wrong time." She tapped the photo of Thomas Miller's body placed by the lake. "But what really sticks out here isn't who Thomas was, it's what the unsub did with him." "You mean the staging?" Claire said. Ellen nodded. "Exactly. Staging doesn't happen randomly. It's a form of communication. Believe it or not, the unsub is trying to talk to us. Maybe they're telling us something about themselves. Maybe they're taunting us. Maybe they're trying to fill in what they perceive as a performance. Regardless of the message itself, it means one crucial thing. They're escalating." "Do we think he's slipping up?" Conway asked cautiously. "Not yet," Ellen admitted curtly. "If he staged this body, it means his confidence is peaking. He doesn't think we're anywhere near catching him." Miles sighed, his hands gripping the back of a chair. "So, a confident killer is out there, dropping clues he thinks we can't interpret?" Ellen glanced knowingly at the detectives. "Pretty much." Widespread panic resurfaces, word spread fast. Despite the police department's efforts to contain the new wave of fear, the discovery of Thomas Miller's body at Fairview Lake reignited the town's already crackling paranoia like gasoline on a dying flame. Marion quickly morphed back into the same suffocating state of fear it had lived in after the first two murders. The lake, once a beloved escape for family picnics and fishing trips, became a spot to avoid at all costs. Joggers canceled their morning routes entirely, wary of becoming the next victim left to rot in the quiet wooded areas that now seemed to surround Marion like vultures circling overhead. "It's chaos all over again," Claire sighed as she stared at the growing stack of false reports flooding into the department. Neighbors accusing neighbors, cryptic anonymous letters with unsubstantiated claims, grainy Polaroids of blurred figures in dark clothing shoved through the mail slot at the station's front desk. "What did you expect? He gave them fresh fuel," Conway muttered, flipping through one of the folders. "Find a body like that in a quiet place like Fairview, and suddenly every guy who owns a shovel looks guilty. This guy's ripped the lid off the town." The killer watches, unbeknownst to the detectives, far on the outskirts of Marion. Someone sat silently in their home, watching the chaos unfurl like a carefully orchestrated performance. The news played in eerie silence, the smile of a reporter delivering the latest grisly updates reflected back in unblinking eyes. They weren't hiding. Not really. They were savoring the stillness, knowing it wouldn't last long before they were ready to strike again. A race against time. The tension in the Marion Police Department was near breaking point. After the discovery of Thomas Miller's body, there wasn't just fear in the air, there was urgency. The murders were no longer outliers, and the killer wasn't lurking in the shadows anymore. They were escalating, sending a clear message to law enforcement: catch me if you can. Detective Claire Roberts felt the weight of each unsolved murder like a cinder block pressing on her chest. The small conference room at the station was cluttered with crime scene photos, maps covered in markings, and discarded coffee cups that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The room was empty apart from Claire and Officer Richard Conway, who sat hunched over at the narrow table, flipping through reports for the 1,000th time. "We're running out of time," Claire muttered, her frustration tangible in the air. She pulled a pin from the map and jabbed it down 2 inches away, adjusting the crime scene radius around Fairview Lake. "If we don't pin this guy soon, someone else is going to die, and this time it could be tonight, or tomorrow." Conway rubbed his temples and slumped back in his chair. "You think I don't know that? I feel like we've been chasing smoke. This bastard's like a ghost. No fingerprints, no solid witnesses, no goddamn pattern to follow." "There's always a pattern," Claire snapped, pacing the room. "Even when it doesn't make sense to us, it makes sense to them. We're missing something." Her gaze landed on Thomas Miller's photo, his hollowed eyes haunting her. "He's leaving us clues. It's just that we're too slow to see them." Conway sighed, leaning his elbows on the table. "What did Miles say last night? Something about tightening the grid around the woods?" "Yeah," Claire replied, shuffling some papers. "He wants search teams out at dawn. Drones, dogs, you name it. He thinks we're close. Closer than this guy's willing to risk. But what happens if the bastard's not in the woods at all?" Conway's tone was bitter, bordering on defeat. "What if he's just sitting in someone's living room, drinking coffee and watching the goddamn news like everyone else?" Claire stopped, leveling a hard stare at Conway. "You know we can't think like that. If he's sitting in someone's living room, we'll get to him there too. But maybe he's somewhere scared. Maybe he's sloppy now. Maybe—" She trailed off, her thoughts clicking into place as she stared down at the map. The connection begins to unfold. By the following morning, the investigative team gathered again in the same conference room, joined by Detective Harry Miles and FBI profiler Ellen Wagner. Claire looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her voice carried a firm resolve. "We've been looking at this all wrong," she began, gesturing to the photos pinned across the crime board. She pointed first to Lucy Parker. "Our first victim, smart, well-loved, young, found in that alley 2 blocks from her home." Next, her finger landed on Darren Brooks. "Second victim, a family guy. Hard-working, kind, kept to himself." Lastly, she pointed out Thomas Miller. "And our most recent, middle-aged loner didn't fit the pattern of being well-known. But there's a connection we've overlooked." "What kind of connection?" Miles asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the table. "They're all vulnerable in different ways," Claire explained. "Lucy's vulnerability was her innocence. She was completely trusting. Darren's was his routine. He probably never thought someone was watching. And Thomas, he was isolated. No one noticed him until it was too late." Ellen nodded in agreement. "That makes sense. Killers like this thrive on vulnerability. It's not about targeting a specific kind of person. It's about finding someone they can control, someone they know won't be able to fight back, or, better yet, someone no one will miss right away." Conway's voice broke in, skeptical. "Okay, but that doesn't narrow it down. Hell, half the town here is vulnerable if you put it that way." Miles cleared his throat, silencing the room. "What it tells us," he said, his voice commanding, "is that this bastard doesn't care who they are. He cares about opportunity, and if he's escalating, he's not just hunting anymore, he's speeding up his kills. That's where we close in." Building the plan. Miles pulled a marker from his pocket and circled the wooded area surrounding Fairview Lake on the map. "This stretch here," he said, directing everyone's focus to the circle, "is where he dumped Miller, but I don't think this is a random drop spot. Look at this lake. It's far enough from town to stay hidden, but not so far that it'd take more than 20 minutes driving. This killer is working inside a controlled radius." Claire stood beside Miles, nodding. "We need eyes on every back road, checking cameras, questioning anyone who might have passed through here in the last few days. I've already got state troopers stationed on the main highway junctions," Miles added. "If this guy makes even one suspicious move, we'll catch him." "And the woods?" Conway asked, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Miles gave a sharp nod. "We send out a full grid sweep the moment the team reports in. No stone unturned. If he's still out there, we flush him out. The clock is ticking." The meeting ended with a collective determination. Officers grabbed their gear, readying for a day-long search that might make or break the case. Claire stood by the window, watching as search teams loaded drones, grid maps, and equipment into patrol vehicles. Conway joined her, his face troubled but resolute. "Do you think this'll work?" he asked quietly. "It has to," Claire replied without hesitation. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop him now—" She trailed off again, unwilling to finish the thought. The images of Lucy, Darren, and Thomas spiraled in her mind, each face a reminder of how high the stakes had become. Conway adjusted his belt and sighed. "Well, here's hoping he's dumb enough to stick around the lake." Claire turned to him, a grim expression on her face. This guy isn't dumb, Rich. He's careful. If we're going to catch him, we're going to have to outthink him. Fear tightens its grip on Marion. While the officers prepared to sweep the woods and roads surrounding Fairview Lake, the town of Marion continued to spiral. Rumors swirled of more victims, and fear echoed louder with each passing hour. Families locked their doors earlier. People avoided the grocery store, wearing hats and sunglasses to keep a low profile, eyes darting suspiciously at anyone who lingered too long in the aisles. At the diner, Melanie Harper and Eleanor Grayson whispered between their steaming cups of coffee. "You hear about that big search they're doing by the lake?" Melanie leaned forward, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound casual. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "They're looking for blood, or worse." She paused, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "You thought about leaving town? You know, just till they catch whoever's behind this?" "No," Melanie replied quickly, almost defiantly. "This is my home, I've got kids, I can't leave, and who's to say the monster wouldn't follow us anyway?" The two women stared at each other, sharing an unspoken dread. It didn't matter how far they ran, they'd still feel him watching. All eyes on the woods. As the day progressed and the woods were combed by teams of searchers, Claire remained at the station, overseeing the live footage being streamed by drones. Each new angle sent a pang of frustration through her gut. Trees, shadows, fallen leaves, nothing out of the ordinary, yet Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were close, so close it tasted bitter in her throat. By evening, Miles stepped into the makeshift operations room, a grim expression forming on his face. "What's the update?" Claire turned toward him, her jaw tight. "Nothing yet. A few scattered footprints, probably hikers from weeks ago, no signs of campsites or anything unusual." Miles didn't respond at first, his hands on his hips, his eyes fixed sternly on the monitor. For all his experience, the pressure of catching a killer before they could strike again was heavy even for him. "This guy," he finally said, his voice a mix of anger and awe. "He's either smarter than we gave him credit for, or he's already planning his next move." Claire nodded silently, her hands tight around her coffee mug. She wasn't sure which option terrified her more. An unexpected suspect emerges. After months of false leads, meticulous tracking, and a growing sense of dread, the pieces of the puzzle finally started to fall into place with a single, surprising revelation. The name Edward Hayes, the kind of name that might have gone unnoticed in any other context, suddenly became central to the hunt for Marion's most feared killer. "Hayes isn't just some nobody," Detective Claire Roberts said, her voice tense as she addressed the team in the cramped conference room. The walls around her were covered in photos, maps, and pinned strings connecting all the fragmented pieces of the investigation. "He's been here this whole time, right on the outskirts of town." Officer Richard Conway furrowed his brow, flipping through the manila folder in front of him. "Edward Hayes, that oddball out by Route 27, lives in that beat-up trailer?" "That's the one." Claire nodded, crossing her arms. Miles, the grizzled lead of the state task force, leaned forward in his chair with a rare look of intrigue. "What's his story? Start from the beginning." The whispered name. Edward Hayes. Claire placed a photo of Edward Hayes on the board. It wasn't a cold mugshot or a grinning yearbook photo. It was a driver's license picture that looked as worn and bland as he seemed to live his life. "Okay, here's what we know. Hayes is in his late 30s, born and raised right here in Marion. He used to work as a medical assistant at the Bloomington Private Clinic until about 8 years ago." Claire hesitated, tapping the photo with her pen. He left the job suddenly after what his co-workers called a personal episode. But what stands out the most, she held up another sheet of paper, he was reprimanded twice for stealing medical supplies. "Medical supplies like what?" Conway asked, leaning forward with his usual skepticism. Claire scanned the document. "Syringes, vials, surgical-grade scissors? Stuff you wouldn't need unless you were operating on something, or someone." "Perfect," Miles muttered grimly, rubbing his chin. "Guy's a loser who dabbled in surgery tools. That tracks." "That's not all," Claire continued, her voice sharper. "After leaving the clinic, he didn't go looking for another job. No career, no connections, no paper trail. It's like he dropped off the radar completely, surviving on odd jobs and staying invisible. His home, that trailer Conway mentioned, it's tucked on a private lot out by Route 27, surrounded by about 3 acres of woods, a hermit." "Sounds like a perfect hiding spot," Miles remarked. "Someone like that could easily slip through the cracks." Ellen Wagner, the profiler from the FBI, chimed in, her voice calm but weighted with thought. "What about the psychological profile? Anything from before he went off-grid?" "His file's thin," Claire admitted. "He's completely clean. No run-ins with the law, no DUIs, no fights we know of. She flipped through her notes. But when we started digging into his past, neighbors described him as quiet, almost too quiet, kept to himself even as a kid. They said his mother was, well, controlling, kept him in check. Apparently he had ambitions for med school, but she couldn't afford it and refused to let him leave town. Some folks said he changed after his mom died, became reclusive, erratic. Conway scoffed. So we've got the classic small-town loner, living alone in a shack full of stolen junk and creepy medical tools. Need I say it? This guy screams serial killer. Miles shot him a warning glance. Don't jump ahead. What turned him into an actual suspect? Give me something solid. The clue that changed everything. Thank the cobbler, Claire said dryly, flipping up a photo of a pair of muddy boots on the projector screen. Miles raised an eyebrow. The cobbler? Yeah, Claire said, clearly fed up with the ridiculous luck of the break. Turns out, Edward brought in a pair of boots for repair about 2 weeks before we found Thomas Miller's body. Guess what? It's a match to the tread patterns we found at Lucy Parker's and Darren Brooks' scenes. The cobbler remembered him. Said the guy barely spoke 2 words, but he recognized his photo when I showed him. Hold up, Conway interrupted, leaning forward, his hand raised like they were in school. You're telling me this guy, who's smart enough to pull off the cleanest crime scenes we've ever dealt with, slipped because he needed his boots patched up? Slipped is an overstatement, Ellen added coolly. That's not sloppiness, it's habit. He probably didn't even think twice about it. Predictability is what gets them in the end. Miles made a low, approving grunt. All right, so we've got boots tying him to the scene. Looks good, but is there more? I don't want to storm into this guy's backyard based on footwear alone. There's more, Claire said with a faint smile. Remember the glass shard from Lucy's crime scene? Lab finally got a partial trace off it. Turns out it came from a specialized vintage medical vial. Only a handful of people in the state could even have access to something like that. She tapped the report in front of her. Guess who fits the bill? Hayes. He used similar vials in his old job, and get this, when we cross-checked his supply thefts from the clinic, you guessed it. Older vials just like this one were on the list. A murmur spread around the room. Even Conway, usually the skeptic, couldn't keep the grudging respect out of his expression. Okay, that's airtight. This guy isn't just our suspect, he's our killer, no question about it. A dark picture unfolds. Ellen rose from her seat, heading toward the whiteboard. Let me tell you what this all means, she said, calm and methodical as she drew lines between photos of the victims and the dramatic arrest. The plan to capture Edward Hayes was carefully laid out with every detail reviewed and rehearsed multiple times. After the discovery of overwhelming clues pointing directly to Hayes, the investigative team couldn't afford a mistake. They were dealing with someone highly methodical, a killer who seemed to thrive on staying one step ahead. Catching him required not just precision, but undeniable proof that would hold up under scrutiny. In a dimly lit briefing room at the Marion Police Department, the team gathered around a map of Route 27 with Edward Hayes's property marked by a bright red circle. The tension was palpable. Detective Claire Roberts stood at the head of the long table, her voice carrying an edge of urgency as she addressed the group. We've got one shot to bring this guy in. He doesn't strike me as the type to go down without a fight, and we can't risk losing him. If he has half the composure we suspect, then the moment he feels cornered, he might destroy evidence or worse, disappear. Officer Richard Conway crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. You think he knows we're onto him? Miles, the seasoned lead of the state task force, answered before Claire could. Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, we don't give him the chance to figure it out. He gestured to the map. His trailer's isolated enough that nobody will hear a commotion, which works in our favor. We'll approach quietly, cut off any escape routes, and go in hard. This guy's not getting away. Ellen Wagner, the FBI profiler who had become an integral part of the case, added, And don't underestimate him. He's controlled, calculating, but that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous. If he feels trapped, he might lash out. Everyone here needs to stay sharp. The plan comes together. Claire laid out the tactical details with the precision of someone who had thought of every potential twist. Here's how it's going to go down. We'll move in the early hours, just before dawn. Darkness gives us the cover we need, and if he's home, he's more likely to be off guard. State troopers will block the 2 access roads leading to and from his property. She pointed at one officer sitting near the door. Hanson, you'll lead the perimeter team to secure the woods. We're fencing him in tight. No one gets in or out unless it's us. Conway leaned forward, frowning. What about knocking first? Give him the chance to surrender before we storm in like we're raiding a drug cartel. You know, basic courtesy? Claire shot him a sharp look. Courtesy? For this guy? We knock, we give him time to lock his door, destroy evidence, maybe grab a weapon? The answer is no. We hit him hard and fast. Miles grunted in agreement. She's right. Hayes isn't just some unhinged local, he's methodical, strategic. If you give him an inch, he'll play us for fools. Satisfied that all angles had been covered, the team broke with a sense of tight anticipation. Officers checked their radios and loaded their weapons. The tension was electric. The raid on Edward Hayes. By the time they reached Hayes's property, dawn was just beginning to crack the horizon, offering a faint glow that barely penetrated the mist hanging over the woods. Hayes's trailer sat in the middle of a small clearing, weathered and slightly sunken on one side. Large, overgrown shrubs surrounded the edges, and an old rusted pickup truck idled silently in the driveway. Claire stood behind the lead team, radio crackling softly at her side. "Eyes on the trailer," she whispered. "No movement yet, let's keep it that way." The officers advanced cautiously, keeping low and sticking to the shadows. The early morning air was cold, their breaths visible as they closed in on the sagging structure. The perimeter team signaled an all clear. No sign of movement in the woods, no signs of escape routes prepped by Hayes. As they neared the trailer, a single barking dog broke the silence from somewhere deep in the woods. Claire's heart skipped for a moment before the sound faded. Miles held up his hand, signaling for everyone to hold. He motioned to the officers closest to the trailer's entrance. Quietly, they took their positions, 2 on either side of the door, another circling behind the trailer to cover the back window. Claire nodded to Miles, who mouthed the countdown. 3, 2, 1. A battering ram smashed against the door with thunderous force, sending it flying open. Officers poured into the dark, cramped living space, shouting commands. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" For a brief moment, nothing happened. The trailer felt disturbingly empty, save for the smell of stale air and something faintly metallic. Then came the sound of rustling from the bedroom. "Living room clear!" one officer shouted. Miles gestured sharply, and the team advanced down the narrow hallway toward the source of the noise. Flashlights cut through the dimness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and stacks of papers cluttering the countertops. "Step out, Edward!" Claire yelled, her voice firm but steady. "Come out now, and no one gets hurt!" More silence. And then, a creak. The bedroom door opened slowly, revealing Edward Hayes. He stood in the doorway, disheveled and eerily calm in a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants. His face was gaunt, but his eyes held an unsettling composure, as if he had been expecting them. His hands were raised, palms forward. "You're early," Hayes said, his voice cold and deliberate. "Hands where I can see them, down on your knees," Claire ordered, her gun trained squarely on him. Hayes smirked but complied, sinking slowly onto the floor. As the officers cuffed him, Miles stepped forward. "Edward Hayes, you're under arrest for the murders of Lucy Parker, Darren Brooks, and Thomas Miller," he said, his voice firm. "We know what you've done." Hayes chuckled softly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you? Or is this just what you think you know?" The horrifying evidence. As Hayes was taken into custody, a forensics team quickly began to comb through the trailer. Within minutes, the first stomach-turning discovery was made. In the small refrigerator by the kitchen, jars filled with cloudy liquid gleamed under the stark light. Inside each jar, a human eye, neatly preserved. "Jesus Christ," Conway muttered, backing away from the fridge. "Bag everything," Claire ordered, her voice tight. She tried to ignore the nausea twisting in her stomach. The search also uncovered a set of surgical tools, meticulously cleaned and arranged on a folding table in the corner. Alongside them were detailed notes, sketches of eyes, diagrams of anatomy, and most disturbing of all, journal entries written in sharp, stilted handwriting. "He's been planning this for years," Ellen observed quietly, as she thumbed through one of the journals. Every detail accounted for. This wasn't just murder, it was art to him. The arrest and its aftermath hours later, as Hayes sat in an interrogation room at the station, his demeanor remained eerily calm. Despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him, he offered no confession. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking at Claire through the one-way glass as if daring her to figure him out. "You catch someone like him," Miles said as he watched from the other side of the glass, "and the real work begins." Claire nodded in agreement. For her, the case wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hayes was behind bars, but his chilling smirk, the preserved eyes, the methodical journals, those would haunt Marion for years to come. The trial that shook the town. By the time Edward Hayes stood trial for his crimes, Marion was a far cry from the quiet, unassuming town it had been a year prior. The arrest had brought a fragile sense of peace, but it didn't erase the trauma. The eyes of the nation were now firmly fixed on this small Midwest town, as the details of Hayes's horrifying acts spilled out into public knowledge. Media circus didn't do justice to the chaos surrounding the trial. News vans lined the courthouse in Marion's modest downtown district. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like glaring reminders that privacy no longer existed here. Reporters jostled for space outside courtrooms, eager to catch even the smallest glimpse of the pale, haunted man accused of orchestrating a series of gruesome murders, preparing for the courtroom battle. Inside the district attorney's office, the atmosphere was tense as the prosecution team prepared for one of the most high-profile cases Marion, or the state, had ever seen. "We can't screw this up," District Attorney Maria Grant said, her voice sharp as she stood at the head of the table. Her team of assistants sat around her, flipping through stacks of crime scene reports, forensic analyses, and psychological evaluations. "The entire town is watching us. Hell, the whole damn country is watching. They want answers. They want justice. And more than anything, they want what that monster did to never happen again." Detective Claire Roberts and her investigative team had been summoned to help finalize the case. Claire sat to Maria's left, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notebook. "Do we know what Hayes' defense strategy is yet?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed in a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Maria nodded, crossing her arms. "Temporary insanity. They're already angling to paint him as some tortured soul. Childhood trauma, unresolved grief over his mother, whatever angle they can pull together to humanize him." "Humanize him?" Claire snapped, her hand tightening around her pen. "Tell that to Lucy Parker's mother. Tell that to Darren Brooks's kids. Humanize him. Jesus Christ." "They have to try, Claire," Maria said gently, but her tone was firm. "We all know it's bullshit. That's why we have to hammer them with the evidence, the preserved eyes, the tools, the journals. There's no insanity defense strong enough to explain that level of planning and brutality. Especially not the journals," one of the assistant prosecutors chimed in. He adjusted his glasses as he flipped through a file. "Those things read like a manifesto. Every step he took was purposeful, calculated. If that doesn't scream premeditation, I don't know what does." Ellen Wagner, the FBI profiler who had been critical to Hayes' capture, leaned forward. "Be careful not to lean too heavily on the journals," she cautioned. "They're chilling, yes, but Hayes might relish the attention they bring him. He's the kind of person who thrives on spectacle. Don't give him the satisfaction of turning this trial into his stage." Claire nodded tightly. "So we hammer the facts." "Facts," Maria agreed. "Hard evidence, eyewitness testimonies, and forensic matches. We stay anchored in the undeniable, and we make sure that jury sees what we did, who he really is." The first day in court. The morning of the trial's opening day, Marion's courthouse felt like a powder keg ready to explode. The hallways were lined with journalists, family members of the victims, and curious locals who had managed to snag a seat in the packed gallery. "Here we go," Officer Richard Conway muttered under his breath as he and Claire stood outside the courtroom waiting for the session to begin. "Think he'll show any remorse?" "No," Claire replied flatly. "Guys like Hayes don't feel remorse, they feel satisfaction." A buzz swept through the crowd as Edward Hayes was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was dressed in a plain gray suit, his hair neatly combed back, but his expression was unsettlingly calm. His eyes scanned the room slowly, and for a brief moment they landed on Claire. She held his gaze, refusing to flinch, though she felt the weight of his stare like a physical blow. "He looks normal," Conway said, his voice low and filled with disgust. "That's the scariest part. He looks just like anyone else." "He's not," Claire said firmly. "Never forget that." The prosecution's opening. Maria Grant stepped up to address the jury, her presence commanding but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing clearly through the silent courtroom, "what you're going to hear over the course of this trial will disturb you. It will challenge your faith in human decency. Edward Hayes didn't just kill. He hunted. He staged. He calculated each and every one of his actions not out of impulse but out of cold, deliberate malice." She gestured toward a table where several sealed evidence bags sat in ominous silence. "You'll see undeniable proof of his crimes. You'll hear from experts. And at the end of this trial you won't have to rely on my words. You'll rely on the facts that scream Hayes' guilt from every angle." Maria paused and let her gaze sweep across the jury, her voice hardening. Justice demands accountability, and justice for Lucy Parker, Darren Brooks, and Thomas Miller will demand that Edward Hayes be held accountable for every life he stole and every nightmare he left behind. The defense struggles. When it was the defense team's turn to speak, their lead attorney, Andrew Calloway, took a very different approach. His soft-spoken demeanor and carefully sympathetic tone were designed to cast doubt more than to prove innocence. "Edward Hayes is a profoundly disturbed man," Calloway began, walking slowly in front of the jury. "Yes, he did terrible things, no one is denying that, but terrible things don't happen in isolation. Edward's entire life has been shaped by loss, by fear, by a desperate struggle for control in a world that has taken everything from him." Calloway's strategy became clear quickly. They weren't trying to prove Hayes' innocence. They were trying to save his life by claiming he wasn't entirely responsible for his actions. "Let me be clear," Calloway continued, raising his hands. "This isn't about excusing Edward Hayes. It's about understanding what drives a man to such horrific extremes, and it's about asking ourselves if there's space for compassion, even in the face of such darkness." Claire, sitting just behind the prosecution's table, leaned toward Maria and whispered, "Do they seriously think this is going to work?" Maria didn't take her eyes off the jury. They don't need it to work, they just need one juror to hesitate. Explosive testimonies. Over the following weeks, the trial unfolded with a steady stream of damning evidence. Forensics experts explained the significance of the boot tread match, the surgical precision of the removed eyes, and the fingerprints found on surgical tools in Hayes' trailer. One of the most chilling moments came when a state crime lab analyst testified about the journals. "These weren't just ramblings," the analyst explained, holding one of the leather-bound books aloft for the jury to see. "These were step-by-step playbooks, plans. He wrote down every detail of his crimes and every emotion he felt while carrying them out." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as excerpts were read aloud. "I don't see life behind their eyes. Only emptiness. It feels like putting something right when I take them." The verdict. After weeks of testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Maria's was fiery and unrelenting, driving home the cruelty of Hayes' actions and the calculated nature of his crimes. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 3 agonizing days during which the town of Marion seemed to collectively hold its breath. Finally, the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the sentence, death. In the back of the courtroom, the families of Lucy Parker, Darren Brooks, and Thomas Miller wept openly, holding each other as the weight of justice finally came down on Edward Hayes. A town forever changed. As Hayes was led out of the courtroom, his face betrayed no emotion, but as he passed the gallery, his lips curled briefly into a smirk, a reminder that even in defeat his mind still worked in ways they would never fully understand. For Marion, the trial was over, but the scars of Edward Hayes' unforgivable crimes would remain for generations. The legacy of a horrific event. Even after Edward Hayes was found guilty and sentenced to death, Marion couldn't simply shake off the trauma he had inflicted. In the days and weeks following the trial, life in the small Midwestern town crept back toward a fragile routine, but the shadow of what had occurred lingered over every street, every alley, every quiet corner of the woods. For those who lived through it, the events tied to Hayes' horrifying spree were more than just a set of gruesome murders. They were a stain, an indelible memory of the fragility of the peace they had once taken for granted. Marion would heal, but the cracks in its foundation would never be fully mended. A town changed forever. Marion had always been the kind of place people described as picturesque and close-knit. A town where everyone knew everyone else, where neighbors left their doors unlocked and a child's bike tossed on a front lawn was simply part of the scenery. But after Hayes, that version of Marion became a relic of the past. It started small. Porch lights were left on all night long, casting eerie glows down deserted streets. Motion sensor lights became a must-have for homeowners who used to rely solely on the goodwill of their neighbors. Locks were upgraded and hardware stores sold out of security cameras in a matter of weeks. Some residents even went as far as installing tall fences, something that had once seemed absurd in their quaint little town. At the local diner, where regulars used to gather to chat over steaming cups of coffee and stacks of pancakes, conversations had taken a darker turn. The good mornings and gossip about high school football games or church picnics were replaced by hushed recollections of their own encounters with Hayes. "You know, I seen him once." An older man named Fred Hare spoke one morning, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "Out by Route 27, he was fixing that old truck of his. Waved at me, can you believe it? Waved at me like he was just a normal guy." Melanie Harper, sitting at the counter with a copy of the local paper, shook her head. "That's the worst part," she murmured. "He was normal, at least, he seemed that way." She looked out the fogged diner windows toward the woods at the edge of town. "Makes you wonder who else out there might be hiding something." The families left behind. For the families of Lucy Parker, Darren Brooks, and Thomas Miller, the word closure felt hollow. The trial had ended, Hayes was in prison and justice had been served on paper, but the wounds left by his actions went deeper than any verdict could heal. Mary Parker, Lucy's mother, became a reluctant figure in the community. People spoke to her in soft tones at the grocery store, offered free coffee at the diner, or left flowers on her doorstep. But the pity was suffocating. "She was my baby," Mary said on more than one occasion in interviews with journalists who swooped into town to report on Marion's fractured soul. She had her whole life ahead of her. And for what? For someone like him to snuff it out? I don't understand. I'll never understand. Darren Brooks' oldest son, Tyler, who had been 11 when his father was killed, struggled to make sense of the tragedy as he grew older. By the time he was in high school, Tyler had stopped participating in sports and withdrew from his friends. A counselor at the high school later noted how the loss of Darren had changed him forever. "He stopped believing people were generally good," the counselor said. "It's like the murder poured a layer of cynicism around him as a child that he could never peel away." And Thomas Miller, who had lived a quiet, almost invisible life, became an unwilling symbol. His name was invoked in safety meetings, his photo pinned to high school bulletin boards as a reminder to be vigilant. Some residents referred to him as the lost man, a cautionary tale about how easily someone could fall through the cracks, unnoticed, until it was too late. The aftermath of justice. The death penalty sentence handed to Hayes brought some satisfaction to Marion, but it also sparked heated debates in the community. While most residents believed Hayes deserved nothing less, others questioned if his execution would bring true justice or answers. At one church service a few months after the trial, Pastor William Green addressed his congregation with a heavy heart. "Forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling, "is not about excusing evil. It's about us finding peace in our own hearts. I don't ask you to forgive Edward Hayes for what he took from this town. I ask you to allow yourselves to find peace despite him. That's what your loved ones would want for you, not more bitterness." For many in the congregation that morning, though, peace felt distant, the legend of Edward Hayes. As time passed, Edward Hayes's story became its own kind of legend in Marion. Children whispered his name to each other at sleepovers, daring one another to venture near the old clearing where his trailer had once stood, long since demolished by county orders. Teenagers drove out to Route 27 at night, the bolder ones parking and claiming they could still feel his presence in the dark woods. Some swore Hayes had left clues behind, that his journals held secrets the police never solved. Truth blended with fiction as stories of Edward Hayes lived on in whispers and folklore, an immortalizing effect no one in Marion wanted, but couldn't seem to stop from spreading. Local journalists published retrospectives on the case every anniversary, ensuring Hayes's name remained front and center in Marion's memory. Though some resisted the attention, others saw it as a grim necessity, a warning to never let down their guard again. Did Marion heal? In the years after the murders, the town slowly began to rebuild its sense of safety. New families moved in, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded on those once peaceful streets. Playgrounds that had been deserted during the height of the fear rang with children's laughter again. But for Marion's longtime residents, the change was permanent. Detective Claire Roberts, though retired by the 10-year anniversary of the trial, still kept a box of case files and photos in her attic. Some nights, unable to sleep, she would sift through them, both haunted by what she saw and comforted that they'd caught the man responsible. "I don't miss the job," she admitted to a former colleague over coffee one afternoon years later, "but I'll always miss the peace, the kind of peace we had before Hayes. I don't know if we'll ever get that version of this town back." The unwritten page. Despite Hayes' conviction, questions lingered for some in Marion. Did Hayes work alone? Were there warning signs law enforcement missed in his youth? Could Lucy Parker, Darren Brooks, or Thomas Miller have been saved if the community had been more vigilant? Such questions only deepened the weight of Hayes's legacy. He wasn't just the man who committed horrible crimes, he was the haunting reminder of how quickly innocence could be shattered, and how hard it was to put the pieces back together.